what I thought I'd do here today that I've never really done before, that I thought it would be fun for me, and hopefully it'll be useful for everybody here, is to talk a little bit about my own journey through the whole kind of my career, and how I've come to some of the conclusions that I've come to here. We'll see. You guys will let me know. Folks will let me know later how helpful this will be for you. I think.
The Rotten Tomatoes will tell you.
I mean, when I start out, I'm starting out as a psychology major. This is back in the mid-1970s. I go to, and like a lot of psychology majors, you're trying to figure out, why it is that you're having problems or depressed, and how you could fix that, and also how you could help people. And so that's a big thing. You decide you're going to be a psychology major. And so I go to school. Actually, I went to Queens College, City University of New York. I should say, if you're trying to figure out this accent, it comes from 21 years in Queens and 30-plus years in Cincinnati, Ohio. So,
you got a Cincinnati accent there.
Anyway, so I go to college there, and they have all these impressive people from Queens College. A lot of these folks are big shots who were at Columbia University. And my first impression, as I think back, as being a psychology major, and I got to tell you, this was in a very innocent era compared to now. I mean, no kids were on drugs back then. This was the mid-1970s. You wouldn't think about putting kids on psychiatric drugs. It was very very innocent in many regards. But I was already seeing things that sort of troubled me a little bit about mental health professional training. And back then, in the 1970s, probably the most famous psychologist in America was a guy named B.F. Skinner. Okay? I see a lot of head shakes. You know who he was. And for those of you who don't know, he was like the big man in terms of this thing called behavior modification. And what was behavior modification? I mean, this is one of my great disappointments about psychology. It was a lot of fancy terms for like common sense stuff. It was about all these positive rewards and negative reinforcements and punishments and all these variable schedules and ratio schedules. And people really seemed to be excited about this, my fellow peers, And I looked at this stuff and I said, this seems like, just like animal training. I mean, I hope you're not thinking about applying this stuff to people. I was hoping in my innocence this was just sort of like things you did with rats in laboratories, And then the other thing I remember troubling me was the book that everybody had to be was assigned. It was this big book by Skinner called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And I thought this was a joke. You got to be kidding. But he really meant that, beyond freedom and dignity. He makes fun of freedom and dignity. He says this don't really exist. I mean, it has to do with you're not aware of external variables or something like that. I remember being 18, 19 years old and going, you're making fun of freedom and dignity. These are my heroes. This is like Thoreau. I mean, Beethoven. I mean, everybody I care about cares about these things. And I didn't seem to see anybody, seeing people in psychology, my fellow my fellow students and faculty, with the exception of one guy I really respected. This would be my thing of a lot about my psychology career. There'd always be one person somewhere who got it, but most folks were going like that. The interesting thing was people in other departments, political science, there were some significant people in Queens College, a guy named Michael Harrington who wrote Other America, he was a famous guy in the 70s and 80s. There were people in philosophy department who taught me the real interesting stuff about William James. I didn't learn that in psychology, but they got it. They got the problems with this behavior modification thing, how it was essentially anti-democratic in a lot of ways. But nobody in the whole psychology world did. So it was like the first area of like feeling like I was sort of a little alienated here and that maybe my connections needed to be elsewhere, outside the mental health profession. But I was committed to becoming a psychologist. And once you go this route, you have to understand, once you try to become a professional, you have incentive and ego attachments to that. This has to be a good career because you like psychology, right? So I was hoping, well, maybe this isn't the way it really is like everywhere. But then I went off on my first practicum assignment, okay, my first professional experience. And for those of you who know New York, one of the big psychiatric hospitals is a place called Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital. So when I was in my senior year there in Queens College there in 1976, I go off to work at this Creedmoor State Psychiatric Hospital there as a volunteer. And it was kind of interesting because when you're a low-level undergraduate, nobody really cares what you do, okay, to a point, which I found out. And so I just hung out with the patients that I liked, and just hung out with them, and the ones, who I couldn't understand, I just didn't I didn't, and it was not that big a deal. But there was one particular guy I remember really liking a lot. He was a depressed guy who'd been diagnosed psychotically depressed, and he was about 50 years old. And I talk a little bit about him in an earlier book. I call him George. And he didn't talk to anyone, which made perfect sense to me. I mean, there were not a lot of people, staff in that place that I really wanted to talk to, and it made sense to me that he was pretty quiet. And anyways, he chose to hang out with me, and we didn't talk that much. We would just play some pool best we could. And somehow word got back to my psychologist supervisor that George was playing pool with me, and that he pulled me into his office, and he told me, George is behaving pro-socially with you. You need to give him a reward. This is a token economy here. This is a token economy. So I remember being, 20 years old and going, what? Well, it turns out the reward was a cigarette. Yes. Because, all the folks are on the Thorazine sucking the, dopamine out of them, destroying their dopamine. So cigarettes help you get a little bit back. So you see everybody's just looking for a drag, and they use them for reinforcements. Anyways, I remember telling this supervisor at 20 years old, and again, I wasn't just Mr. Anti-Psychiatry. I don't even know if I read R.D. Laing or Thomas Sass or any of that stuff then. But I just remember telling him, I said, this doesn't feel good to me, man. This is like I'm 20 years old. This is a 50-year-old man. You want me to give him a token, a reward for hanging out with me? And that was the first time in my life I saw a mental health professional move from just being sort of passive and phlegmatic to really being pissed off. And I really didn't know what I was getting into. So he made it really clear that if I did not do this, I would get kicked off the ward. I'd get fired. And you want to get into graduate school, and you want to get your A for the little class and all that. So I said, well, I got a problem. But the lucky thing I had going for me was I hadn't gone through all the mental health professional training yet, and I didn't know all about appropriateness and boundaries and all that. So it occurred to me that I was hanging out with George to just talk to him about this problem that I've got now. And so George said to me, very simply, said, don't worry about it, we'll win, just give me the cigarette, we'll go to the day room. So he was 50, and I trusted him. He seemed to have a lot of confidence in this whole thing. So we went out there, and I got to tell you, this was 1976. It was right after One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest had come out. That was my experience of mental wards, watching it. And this place was exactly like it. I mean, you had all the staff behind the glass window in the nurse's station. They almost never came out, except to come out with little paper cups with water and the pills. They come out and hand it out. And so we were standing there right in front of the window where all the staff were, my boss there, the psychology supervisor, the nurses, all those people just huddled up and they were looking at us. And George turns to me and says, okay, they're all looking now, give me the cigarette. So I handed him the cigarette. And George, he took the thing and he just looked at these people. I never forget this look on his face. It's like over 3 decades ago for me now. And I'll never forget, he just looked at him and said, I'm in this, he didn't say anything, but so expressive in his face. Just like, I'm in this mental ward here, and I'm diagnosed as crazy, but you people are subhuman. This was coming out of his eyes. And he took the cigarette and he went over. There was another patient who had been diagnosed catatonic because they just sat there all day like that and did nothing but like that. And he took the cigarette and he just put it in the pocket of that person. And he looked, and he came back and he looked at them and he just gave them another shake. And then he looked at me and we just left. And I remember thinking, like, my God, you people and B.F. Skinner, I mean, you people are all beyond freedom and dignity, but not George. George was not beyond it. And so I was the first experience, but I have to tell you, again, you've got such, I've got such, and we all do, professionals, we have such attachment to moving on with the career that you tell yourself all kinds of things. Well, this was only in this institution, that was only in that school, so it's move on, okay? So